The Whitmore estate sat on 11 acres of manicured silence, the kind of property that existed to remind the world that some people live differently. Not better, differently. The hedges were trimmed to mathematical precision. The gravel in the circular driveway was raked each morning before dawn, erasing every tire track, every footprint, as if the family materialized there by divine appointment rather than automobile. I had worked for the Whitmores for 19 years. 19 years of knowing which flowers Mrs. Whitmore preferred in the breakfast room, depending on her mood. 19 years of understanding that Mr. Whitmore took his coffee at exactly 6:15, not because he was punctual, but because he needed 30 minutes of silence before facing his wife. 19 years of watching their children grow from entitled toddlers into polished adults who looked through me the way sunlight passes through glass, present, necessary, but never quite real. My name is Loretta Mae Jenkins. I was 53 years old the autumn everything changed, and I had long since stopped expecting anything to. That's the trick of domestic service in houses like these. You learn to exist in the margins of other people's stories. You become fluent in invisibility, not because they force it upon you, but because survival has its own grammar, and some lessons are taught without words. The morning of October 14th began like any other, gray light through the kitchen windows, the hum of the industrial refrigerator, the smell of coffee grounds and fresh-cut lemons. I had my routines, my rituals, the small ceremonies that gave shape to days that otherwise blurred into sameness. But something was different that morning. I felt it before I understood it, the way you feel a storm coming before the first cloud appears. There was a tightness in the house, a held breath that nobody would acknowledge. Mr. Whitmore had been in his study until 3 in the morning. I knew because I'd heard his footsteps pacing above my quarters in the carriage house. Mrs. Whitmore had taken 2 sleeping pills instead of 1. I knew because I counted them each week when I organized her medicine cabinet. These were the details I collected without trying. The invisible accumulate knowledge the way rivers accumulate sediment, slowly, constantly, until one day you realize you're standing on something solid. The family had money. Old money that had learned to make new money, the most dangerous kind. Harrison Whitmore III had inherited a textile empire from his father and transformed it into something more modern, more opaque. Investment vehicles, holding companies, entities with names that meant nothing and addresses in countries I couldn't pronounce. I didn't understand the business. I wasn't meant to. But I understood people. And I understood that for the past 6 months, Mr. Whitmore had become a man being eaten from the inside. He'd lost weight. His golf handicap had worsened. He'd started locking his study door, something he'd never done in all my years of service. Loretta? His voice startled me that morning as I arranged the breakfast service. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, still in his robe, which was unusual. Harrison Whitmore was a man who believed in the armor of clothing. I had never seen him in the common areas without being fully dressed. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." The fresh flowers. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the arrangement I'd placed on the breakfast table. White roses, baby's breath, a touch of eucalyptus. Mrs. Whitmore prefers the yellow ones when she's feeling delicate. You know that. I did know that. But Mrs. Whitmore wasn't feeling delicate. She was feeling afraid, and afraid women don't want soft colors reminding them of their vulnerability. They want white, the color of surrender, yes, but also the color of snow, of blank pages, of starting over. I didn't say any of this. "Of course, sir. I'll change them right away." He nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he stood there, his hand gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping him upright. For a moment, just a moment, Harrison Whitmore looked at me. Not through me, at me. As if he was seeing a human being standing in his kitchen instead of a function in an apron. "You've been with us a long time, Loretta." 19 years this December, sir. 19 years. He repeated it like he was trying to understand what the words meant. "That's longer than my marriage to Patricia, longer than my partnership with Gerald, longer than most of my friendships." A pause. "Longer than my children have known me as anything other than a disappointment." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. When a man starts confessing before breakfast, you don't interrupt. You simply bear witness, the way you bear witness to weather. "I want you to know," he continued, "that whatever happens, I've always—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "You've been loyal. I see that, even if I've never said it. Then he was gone, padding back down the hallway in his leather slippers, leaving behind a silence that felt different from all the silences that had come before. I changed the flowers to yellow. Some instincts are more important than truth. That afternoon, I found the first document. It was in the library, wedged between the cushions of Mr. Whitmore's reading chair, a single sheet of paper, dense with numbers and names and abbreviations that meant nothing to me. It must have fallen from one of his folders during his late-night pacing. I should have placed it on his desk. That's what I would have done any other day, returned the wayward item to its proper place. No questions asked, no thoughts entertained. But something made me pause. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at me that morning. Maybe it was the weight in his voice when he said, "Whatever happens." Maybe it was 19. Years of swallowed curiosity finally demanding attention. I read the document. I didn't understand most of it, but I understood enough. Names of shell companies, dates of wire transfers, amounts that made my annual salary look like pocket change. And at the bottom, a phrase that I did recognize because I had watched enough television in my small carriage house apartment to know what it meant. Federal investigation pending. DOJ file, Yamao Swom 71W. The Whitmores were being investigated, and from the looks of the paper in my hands, they had been for quite some time. I placed the document on his desk, then I returned to my duties. But something had shifted inside me. A hairline fracture in the foundation of my assumed ignorance. For 19 years, I had moved through this house believing that my invisibility protected me, that existing in the margins kept me safe from the stories unfolding at the center. I was wrong. The invisible see everything, and eventually, the things we see start to weigh. The days that followed were a masterclass in maintained appearances. Mrs. Whitmore continued her Wednesday luncheons with the women from her charity board. Mr. Whitmore still left for his office at 7:30 each morning, his suit pressed, his tie knotted with military precision. Their daughter Caroline flew in from San Francisco for her monthly visit, bringing her new boyfriend, a tech entrepreneur with kind eyes and nervous hands. Nobody mentioned the investigation, nobody mentioned anything at all. But the house knew. Houses always know. The way the air gets thicker before a storm. The way wood groans when weight shifts. I had learned to read this mansion the way sailors read the sea, and what I read now was fear masquerading as routine. I started noticing things I had trained myself to ignore. The shredder in Mr. Whitmore's study, which now ran for hours at a time. The private conversations between husband and wife that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. The new security system installed without announcement, with cameras in hallways where cameras had never been before. And then there was Gerald. Gerald Thorne had been Mr. Whitmore's business partner for over 20 years. I had served him countless dinners, mixed his preferred martinis, 2 olives, stirred not shaken, with a whisper of vermouth. He was a man who smiled easily and said little, which I had always read as discretion. Now I wondered if it was something else. He began visiting more frequently, late nights in the study with the door locked, whispered conversations that ended the moment footsteps approached. I would bring coffee, and both men would fall silent with such practiced ease that the silence itself became a third presence in the room. One evening, while refreshing their drinks, I caught a fragment of their conversation through the study door before they heard my approach. "Can't let her take the fall alone. Patricia doesn't know anything, and we both know it." That was Mr. Whitmore's voice, strained. What Patricia knows or doesn't know won't matter if they have the documentation. Gerald's voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. The question is damage control, what can be contained and what can be sacrificed. Sacrificed? I knocked and entered with my tray. Both men transformed instantly, smiles sliding into place like masks at a masquerade. Gerald complimented the cheese selection. Mr. Whitmore asked about the weather forecast for the weekend. I played my part. I always played my part. But that word stayed with me. Sacrificed. In my experience, when wealthy men start talking about sacrifice, they're rarely offering themselves. The crack widened 3 days later. I was cleaning the guest room that Caroline's boyfriend had vacated. He'd returned to San Francisco early, a strained goodbye at the front door, when I found the second set of documents. These weren't accidental. They had been deliberately hidden, taped to the back of a dresser drawer where only someone moving the furniture would find them. Someone like me. This time, I took longer to read, and this time I understood more than I wanted to. The documents detailed a decade of financial manipulation, pension funds drained, retirement accounts redirected, working families, thousands of them, whose modest investments had been siphoned into the Whitmore machine. The numbers were staggering, but what struck me most were the names. Regular names: Maria Gonzalez, Robert Chen, Wanda Jefferson. People like me who had trusted their futures to institutions they believed would protect them. People who had been erased from consideration as easily as tire tracks in gravel. I thought about my mother, who had worked as a housekeeper until her hands couldn't grip a mop anymore. I thought about her tiny pension, the one she'd protected so fiercely, counting every dollar like a blessing. I thought about what would happen to a woman like her if someone had decided her savings were expendable. And I thought about the Whitmores. For 19 years, I had told myself a story, that they were good people, flawed perhaps, distant certainly, but fundamentally decent. I had watched their children's birthday parties. I had seen Mrs. Whitmore cry quietly after her miscarriage, had brought her tea and clean tissues without a word. I had heard Mr. Whitmore laugh genuinely at his grandson's first steps, had witnessed moments of unguarded humanity that seemed to contradict everything I now held in my hands. Which version was the truth? Both, I realized. That was the cruelty of it. Humans aren't one thing or another. They're everything at once, capable of tenderness and ruthlessness, love and theft, kindness to the person in front of them, and indifference to the thousands they'll never see. The wealthy simply have more room to be contradictory. Their walls are higher, their margins wider. They can love their children and steal other people's futures without ever having to reconcile the two. I returned the documents to their hiding place, but I didn't forget where they were. Mrs. Whitmore called me into the sitting room later that week. She was alone, which was unusual. Patricia Whitmore didn't like solitude. She filled her days with committees and lunches and phone calls, building a fortress of social engagement against the silence she couldn't bear. But that afternoon, she sat alone by the window, her manicured hands folded in her lap, like she was praying to a god she wasn't sure existed. "Loretta, please sit." In 19 years, Mrs. Whitmore had never asked me to sit in her presence. Servants stand, that's the arrangement, the unspoken contract that maintains proper distance. The offer itself was disorienting, like being addressed in a language you'd heard but never spoken. I sat. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course, ma'am. Do you think—" She stopped, gathered herself, started again. "In your experience of this household, have I been kind? Have I treated you fairly?" It was such a strange question. And yet, watching her face, I understood what she was really asking. She wasn't seeking reassurance about her domestic management. She was asking if she was a good person, if the version of herself she believed in could survive whatever was coming. "You've been a fair employer, Mrs. Whitmore." "That's not what I asked." No, it wasn't. But fair was all I had to offer. Fair was the neutral territory where truth and mercy could coexist. Kind would have been a lie. Cold would have been cruel. Fair was the compromise that servants learned to make. She studied my face for a long moment, searching for something I wasn't sure I had. Then she nodded, as if I'd confirmed a suspicion she'd been carrying. "If anything happens to this family," she said quietly, "I want you to know it wasn't because we didn't care about anything, about anyone." She looked out the window at the immaculate grounds, the trimmed hedges, the raked gravel. "We just got lost, somewhere along the way. We forgot what we were supposed to be protecting." I didn't know if she was talking about their fortune or their souls. I suspected she didn't know either. The call came on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because Tuesdays I deep clean the silver. And I was standing at the butler's pantry sink when I heard Mr. Whitmore's phone ring in his study. I heard him answer with his business voice, the one that was calm and firm and utterly controlled. And then I heard the silence that followed, a silence that stretched for so long I almost went to check if he'd collapsed. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he looked like a man who had just been told the date of his own execution. Not surprised, that was the strange part. Not surprised at all, just resigned, the way you resign yourself to weather. "Loretta," he said, "please cancel all of Mrs. Whitmore's appointments for the rest of the week, and call Caroline. Tell her she needs to come home." "Shall I give a reason, sir?" He looked at me with those empty eyes. Tell her it's a family matter. 3 days later, the lawyers descended. They set up camp in the formal dining room, converting the mahogany table where the Whitmores had hosted governors and senators into a war room of legal strategy. Yellow legal pads, laptop screens glowing, coffee cups multiplying like evidence of some desperate sleepless siege. I served them. I cleared their plates. I refreshed their water glasses and emptied their wastebaskets. And as I moved through the room, I listened. The FBI had been building a case for 2 years. They had documentation. They had witnesses. They had flipped one of the junior partners at Mr. Whitmore's firm, a young man named Derek, whose wedding I had helped cater, whose wife had complimented my salmon croquettes with genuine enthusiasm. Derek, it seemed, had decided that his future was worth more than his loyalty. "The exposure is comprehensive," one of the lawyers was saying as I gathered the lunch dishes. "Harrison, I need you to understand what we're facing. They're not looking at this as a corporate matter. They're treating it as organized criminal enterprise." "That's absurd," Mrs. Whitmore snapped. "My husband is a businessman, not a gangster." "With respect, Patricia, the distinction matters less than you'd think when we're talking about RICO charges." I didn't know what RICO meant, but I knew the way Mr. Whitmore flinched when the lawyer said it. I knew the way Mrs. Whitmore's carefully maintained composure cracked, just for a moment, before she rebuilt it with visible effort. And I knew, watching Gerald Thorne in the corner of the room, that he was not flinching at all. Gerald was calm, too calm. The calm of a man who had already made his arrangements. That night, I did something I had never done in 19 years of service. I went looking. I couldn't have explained why, even to myself. Call it instinct. Call it the accumulation of too many noticed glances, too many calculated silences, too many moments when Gerald's composure seemed rehearsed rather than natural. I went to his overnight bag, left carelessly in the guest room he was using, and inside, tucked into an interior pocket, I found what I was looking for without knowing I was looking for it. A letter of immunity. Gerald Thorne had made a deal with the federal government. In exchange for his testimony, he would face no prosecution. The document was dated 6 weeks ago, 6 weeks of sitting at that dining room table, strategizing with the very people he was prepared to destroy. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. What stopped my heart was the list of evidence he had agreed to provide, including testimony that Patricia Whitmore had been aware of and complicit in the financial schemes from the beginning. Mrs. Whitmore, the woman who had asked me if she had been kind, the woman who spent her days organizing charity auctions for children's hospitals, the woman who, according to this document, was about to be served up as a sacrifice on the altar of Gerald Thorne's freedom. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Then I went to my quarters and sat in the dark for a very long time. Here's what they don't tell you about servitude, about invisibility, about existing in the margins of other people's stories. Eventually, you have to decide who you are, not who they made you, not who circumstances forced you to become, but who you are, at the core of yourself, when no one is watching and no one will ever know. I had spent 19 years protecting myself through silence, through not seeing what I saw, through converting observations into forgetfulness with the efficiency of muscle memory. But I had seen too much now, and the seeing had changed me. I thought about the pension funds, the thousands of Maria Gonzalez's and Robert Chen's whose futures had been stolen. I thought about justice and whether it could exist in a system where people like Gerald Thorne could trade their crimes for immunity while people like Patricia Whitmore became convenient targets. And I thought about my mother, about what she would say if I told her what I knew, about what she would want me to do. She would tell me to protect myself, to stay quiet, to let the wealthy eat each other while I remained safely invisible. She would be right from a certain angle. But she had also raised me to believe that some things matter more than safety. The question was, what was I willing to sacrifice to prove it? The FBI came at dawn. I had expected sirens, shouting, the dramatic choreography of television arrests. Instead, they came quietly. A convoy of black SUVs that rolled up the gravel driveway with the inevitability of a funeral procession. No flashing lights, no megaphones. Just men and women in dark suits, walking toward the front door with the calm efficiency of people who had done this many times before. I was already awake. I had been awake all night. The lead agent's name was Vivian Torres. I would learn this later, but I noticed her immediately, a Latina woman in her 40s with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. She stood at the door while her team fanned out through the property, and she waited while I, still in my housecoat, went to wake Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. "Federal agents, sir." My voice was steady, though my hands were not. "They have a warrant." What followed was a kind of controlled chaos. Agents in every room, opening drawers, photographing documents, seizing computers. Mrs. Whitmore in her silk robe, trembling, clutching her husband's arm as their world was dismantled around them. Caroline, arriving too late, kept behind the police barrier at the end of the driveway, screaming her mother's name. And Gerald Thorne, standing off to the side with his own lawyer, watching the destruction he had orchestrated, with the detachment of a surgeon observing a procedure. I served coffee. It was absurd, I knew, offering refreshments during a federal raid, but it was also the only thing I knew how to do, the only way I knew to exist in the space between action and paralysis. Agent Torres found me in the kitchen. "You're Loretta Jenkins, the housekeeper?" "Yes, ma'am." 19 years of service, according to our records. She said it neutrally, but I heard the question underneath. "How much do you know? What have you seen? Whose side are you on?" "That's correct." She studied me for a long moment. "We're going to need to interview all household staff, separately. I hope you'll cooperate." "Of course." She turned to leave, then paused. "You know, in cases like these, the staff usually knows more than they let on. They see the small things that add up to big pictures. What they choose to share, or not share, can make a significant difference in how these situations unfold." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was an invitation, a door left open, waiting to see if I would walk through. I thought about the documents hidden behind the dresser drawer, about Gerald's letter of immunity, about the thousands of names on those financial records, ordinary people whose lives had been reduced to figures in a ledger. I thought about Mrs. Whitmore asking me if she had been kind, and I thought about the choice I had stayed awake all night preparing to make. "Agent Torres," I said, "there are some things I think you should see." I led her to the guest room. I showed her the hidden documents, the ones that outlined the full scope of the scheme, the ones that Gerald didn't know I had found. And then I told her about the letter of immunity, about Gerald's deal, about the way the case had been constructed to make Patricia Whitmore the primary target while the man who had architected everything walked free. Agent Torres listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. It was a fair question. From the outside, my action made no sense. I was betraying my employers, the people who had paid my salary for 19 years, who had provided my housing, my health insurance, the stability of my existence. I was inserting myself into a situation that had nothing to do with me, risking consequences I couldn't predict. "Because I've spent 19 years watching," I said, "watching how decisions get made in places like this, watching who gets protected and who gets thrown away. And I realized that my silence isn't neutral, my invisibility isn't innocence. Every time I looked away, I was making a choice. I was choosing to let the ones with power decide who would be sacrificed." I paused, searching for words to explain something I was only beginning to understand myself. "Mrs. Whitmore isn't innocent. I'm not saying she is. But she's not what he's making her out to be either. And those people, the ones whose pension funds were stolen, they deserve better than a deal that lets the architect go free while a convenient target takes the fall." I met Agent Torres's eyes. "I'm not trying to save the Whitmores. I'm trying to make sure the truth isn't tailored to protect the people it should hurt most." Agent Torres nodded slowly. Then she made a call. What happened next unfolded with a different kind of inevitability. Gerald Thorne was detained before he could leave the property. The hidden documents were added to the evidence. Lawyers who had been confidently negotiating found their strategies suddenly inadequate. And Mrs. Whitmore, Patricia, I suppose I could call her now, was told that the case against her had changed, not dismissed, not forgiven, but restructured, recalibrated to reflect a more accurate picture of responsibility. She found me in the kitchen that afternoon, after the agents had finally left, after the last SUV had rolled down the driveway and disappeared into a world that would never look the same. "Loretta," her voice was hoarse. Her careful composure was gone entirely, replaced by something rawer and more human than I had ever seen from her. "They told me what you did, what you showed them." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Why?" She was crying now, not the elegant tears of a society woman performing distress, but the ugly, honest crying of someone who no longer had the energy to pretend. After everything, after how we've treated you, after the way why would you help me? I thought about the question. I had been asking myself the same thing for hours. I didn't do it for you, I finally said. I did it for the truth. The truth includes your culpability, and you're going to face that. But the truth also includes Gerald's betrayal and the real shape of what happened here, and the people who deserve to know who actually stole their futures. I paused. You asked me once if you had been kind. The answer is complicated. But I've decided that my answer, who I am, what I choose, doesn't have to be. She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Maybe she was. The trials took 18 months. I testified twice, once for the prosecution, once at Gerald Thorne's newly opened case. I told the truth, all of it, including the parts that made me uncomfortable, the parts where I had stayed silent for 19 years, the parts where my invisibility had been a kind of complicity. Gerald Thorne's immunity deal was vacated when the full scope of the hidden documents came to light. His cooperation, it turned out, had been strategically incomplete, designed to protect himself while maximizing damage to his partners. The federal prosecutors were not amused by what they called selective transparency. He received 12 years. Harrison Whitmore received 8, though his lawyers expect earlies, release for good behavior. The pension funds were partially recovered. Not entirely, not enough, but something. Maria Gonzalez got back 43 cents on every dollar she had lost. Not justice exactly, but closer than nothing. And Patricia Whitmore received 3 years of probation and significant financial penalties. She would lose the house, the cars, the membership to the clubs that had defined her identity. She would become, for the first time in her life, a woman without a fortune to hide behind. I watched her walk out of the courthouse after her sentencing. She looked smaller than I remembered, not just physically, but in the way she carried herself. The careful posture was gone. The performance of wealth had been stripped away, leaving behind a woman who would have to discover who she was without it. She saw me standing at the edge of the crowd. For a long moment, we looked at each other, two women whose lives had intersected for 19 years without ever truly meeting. Then she nodded, just once, and I nodded back. Some endings arrive dressed as forgiveness. I don't work for wealthy families anymore. After the trial, I used my savings to start a small cleaning service of my own. Just me at first, then 2 other women who had spent their lives in service and wanted something that belonged to them. We clean houses for ordinary people now. Families with children who leave toys on the stairs. Elderly couples who tell us about their grandchildren while we dust their bookshelves. Single mothers who apologize for the mess and don't realize that their chaos is beautiful because it's honest. I make less money than I made at the Whitmore estate, but I sleep better. And when I look in the mirror, I recognize the woman looking back. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that morning when Mr. Whitmore stood in the kitchen doorway and told me I had been loyal. I think about what loyalty means, whether it's silence in the face of wrongdoing or something more demanding, something that requires us to see clearly even when looking away would be easier. I think about Mrs. Whitmore asking if she had been kind. And I think about the question underneath the question, whether we can be good people while participating in systems that do terrible things. Whether ignorance is an excuse or a choice. Whether the invisible bear responsibility for what they witness. I don't have answers to most of these questions, but I've learned that asking them is important. That the moment you stop asking is the moment you start disappearing. Not because others make you invisible, but because you've made yourself absent from your own moral life. The Whitmore estate was sold at auction last spring. I drove past it once, just to see. The hedges were overgrown. The gravel was unraked. The grand facade looked tired, like a woman caught without her makeup. Still impressive, but diminished somehow. More human. They're turning it into a conference center. I heard. Corporate retreats and leadership seminars. Business people will walk those halls and eat catered lunches in the room, where I used to serve coffee during federal raids. They'll never know what happened there. The building will keep its secrets, the way buildings do. But I'll remember. And sometimes remembering is its own kind of justice. I was asked by a reporter who tracked me down after the trial whether I regretted my decision, whether I ever wished I had stayed quiet, stayed safe, stayed invisible. I told her the truth. I think about it every day. What I risked, what I gained, The moment I stopped being a witness and became something more, a participant, a decision maker, a person who chose. But regret? No. Regret is for people who believe their safety was ever guaranteed. I had been invisible for 19 years, and it hadn't protected me from anything. It had only prevented me from knowing who I was. The truth doesn't break people, the pretending does. And I was tired of pretending. These days, I have a small apartment with windows that look out on a park. In the mornings, I drink my coffee and watch the joggers pass, the dog walkers, the parents pushing strollers. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, building futures they trust, will be protected. Sometimes I wonder how many of them know what invisibility costs. How many of them are making the same bargains I made? Silence for safety, blindness for belonging, their better selves exchanged for a seat at the margin of someone else's story. I can't save them from those bargains. I can only tell my story and hope that somewhere, someone hears it. Someone who stands in kitchens while powerful men confess. Someone who finds documents they weren't meant to find. Someone who wonders, in the dark of night, whether seeing carries responsibility. It does, it always did. We just don't like to admit it. The woman I was before, the Loretta who counted sleeping pills and raked gravel from her consciousness, she's gone now. I mourned her for a while. She kept me safe for 19 years, and her loss felt like a kind of death. But the woman who replaced her is more real, more present, more willing to be seen. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the only ending any of us can hope for. Not triumph, not vindication, but the quiet peace of becoming who we always should have been. By dawn, the city forgot, but I didn't. That's how survival sounds. Quiet, like a choice made in the dark, like the first breath after a long silence, like the moment you realize you were never invisible at all. You were just waiting to be seen.